So I want to wrap this presentation up with a clear focus on animation and rendering. And so I'll just jump in really quickly, and I want to demonstrate the basic concepts in Cinema 4D to create very simple animation. And in order to do this, I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to demonstrate with just a simple cube. So I've introduced a cube into the equation, and I'll scroll out just a bit so that I can see this a little bit more clearly. Now, when it comes to animation, there's a few things that we want to keep in mind. The first thing is that we're playing at a frame rate of 30 frames per second. So for every frame of information that we have, or for every 30 frames of information that we have, it's equivalent to 1 second in time. And by default, Cinema 4D starts a project with 90 frames of information. So we have roughly 3 seconds of animation to play with in Cinema 4D, and of course we can always scale that up or down as needed. Now if we look down here just below the perspective viewport and just above the material editor, we have some of the timeline controls. And so we have this green rectangle. This green rectangle represents the playhead, and the playhead is the indicator of where you are in time. And the basic concept here is when I look at this timeline, we're on frame 0 and we go all the way up to frame 90. And if we were to take this playhead, we can click and drag and scrub this playhead back and forth. And as I do that, you can see there's a frame indicator over here telling me exactly what frame I'm on. And this represents our location in time. So when we create an animation or we're playing our playhead through time, our playhead is going to advance. And for each frame of information that we have 1/30th of a second. And so at frame 30, that's 1 second of information. Between frame 30 and 60, that's 2 seconds of information, and up to 90, which is 3 frames. And so as I drag this around, this is my indicator, my current position in time, and that'll be a really important feature here in just a minute. Just below that, we have our start frame and our end frame, and then we have this power slider here, and I would suggest that we avoid using this slider, but I just want to point out that you can kind of scale this slider down, and that will allow you to zoom in on your timeline, and then you can use that to slide back and forth. But I'm going to leave this in the default position, and I'm going to leave this at the default frame setting. Now, for every frame inside our animation, we have to do a still render. So in a previous presentation, I was creating some renders, and I was like at 20 or 30 seconds based on the settings that I created. Now take 30 seconds, multiply that by 90, and then plus some change here, just to create a simple 90 frame animation. So there is a price that we're going to pay with regard to the amount of time it takes to render. So we want to factor and budget that into our project. So we have our timeline here. We have our start and end frame. So if we did need more frames in our animation, we could actually just change this value here. So in the event that I want to make a 6-second animation, I would take 6, multiply it by 30, which gives me 180, and I could type in 180 frames. In addition to that, I could do multiple renders of, just small sequences and then stitch them together in something like iMovie, Premiere, Final Cut, that sort of thing. But I'm going to let this default to 90 frames. To the right of that, we have some playhead control. So if I hit the play button, you can see that it advances the playhead. I'll pause it. I can step back or step forward based on frames. I could go to the start or the end of time as well. Typically what I do when I'm starting to animate is I'll hit the play button, I'll pause, and just manually kind of drag the playhead around to see what kind of information or how the information changes on screen. To the right of that, we have our keyframe tools, and we're going to focus just on this red icon with the picture of the key on it. Everything else, this stuff we want to avoid. All these other toggle buttons over here, we don't want to click on any of these because these are the parameters that are going to be recorded over time. And the basic concept here is that if we want to animate an object in space, we'll make sure that we have that object selected. I'm going to establish the position that I want this object to start in. So I'm going to determine that I want my object to start here and over time move across the stage. So I'm going to position my object. I'm going to make sure that I'm at the beginning of time. So I'm going to scrub my playhead back to the beginning of time, or I'll just use this manual rewind button. And once I have my cube object selected and I have it in the position that I want and my playhead is representing the point in time that I want, in this case the start of time, I'm going to roll over and I'm going to press the record keyframe. This red icon with the key on it, when I click on it one time, once I do that, you'll notice a little tick appears down here in the timeline. Now I'm going to advance the playhead. I'm going to change the position of my object, and I'm going to go back and record the keyframe again. Once I do that, you'll see that it creates a motion path, and now I have the position of the object is recorded at the beginning of time. As I advance the playhead or scrub the playhead back and forth, you can see that object is transitioning from the first position, the first keyframe that we recorded, later in time to that second position. So let me review that really quickly. I'm just going to create a cube. I'm going to zoom out just a bit. Now, I want to start at the first position or the beginning of time, and my playhead is already at the first frame. I can see it down here. That's the little green rectangle. And what I'm going to do, my storyboard or my animation calls for this object to start down here in the bottom left corner of my screen and move back here towards the top right. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that the object is selected. I'm going to position this object where I want it to start, and I'm going to record that keyframe, or I'm going to record the position, the scale, the rotation, and other parameters of that object at this point in time. So whenever I hit the record keyframe, it's remembering the position and all those other attributes of the object on this frame in time. So the recipe for animation then calls for me to advance the playhead into a different point in time. I'll advance the object to represent the position change that I want at that point in time, and I'll hit the record keyframe. And you can see that once I do that, it shows me an animation path and creates that path. Now, as I scrub the playhead or as I hit the rewind button, hit the play button, you can see that that animation starts to unfold over time. Now, if I want to modify that animation path along the way, I can stop my playhead about halfway through, and in this case it'd be 45 frames, and I could lift that object up if I wanted to. Now, in order to preserve that position change, I need to record a keyframe, and if I don't, what's going to happen, as soon as I scrub the playhead, that object snaps back in time because I didn't record that position change. So if I advance the playhead to about, I could just do this visually and say, okay, right about there, I want this object to be up in the air. I'll just click and move it up. Now I got to record that position change, and when I do, you can see that the animation path starts to change. I now have 3 keyframes or points of change in time, and as I scrub the playhead, it's going to transition from all of the parameters that were recorded for that object, so the position, the scale, the rotation of that object, and as I advance to that, looks like about frame 34, I'd created a new keyframe, and it's transitioning to that position, and then from frame 34 to 90, it's transitioning to the end position. You can see that I have little control points on my animation path here, and if I want to, those are represented by the keyframes in time, so I can get a sense of, okay, I have a keyframe here at frame 34, and if I want to change that position, I could just kind of click and drag this around. Now, this isn't the best view to do this because I don't have a real clear idea of what I'm doing, in terms of how I'm adjusting this, but I can just click and drag that animation path around if I want to. I'll scrub my playhead back and forth, and now I have a different animation occurring. And if I want to push that a little bit further, I could just advance the playhead somewhere, and if I grab the rotation tool, and I'll just take the rotation and kind of flip this thing around a few times and hit the record button, and so now as I scrub the playhead, I'm getting a transition. Now it is important to see or to note that there are keyframes here, and we always want to kind of borrow keyframes as needed. So if I wanted to, kind of modify the rotation, I noticed that I have a keyframe here, and it's not a bad idea to roll my playhead over top of an existing keyframe and make a rotation and update that keyframe. Okay, because if I back this playhead off just a little bit and I rotate this keyframe and I record it, I've just modified that timeline, and you can see that the animation path changes dramatically. So I don't want to take a deep dive into animation, but I did want to start to get you functional, because what I want to do is I want to start to control basic camera, a basic camera position change from point A to point B, or maybe a 3 or 4 point animation, just something really simple. And we're going to use this same principle that we just looked at. So let me review that one more time. And by the way, animation is we can think of it as kind of object oriented. In other words, if I select my cube, if it has an animation path, I can see that in the perspective viewport. If I introduce another object, a sphere, because I have that sphere selected, I don't see the animation path in my perspective viewport anymore, and I don't see the little keyframes that appeared inside my timeline window. The minute that I go back to my cube, I can see that, okay, there's the animation path that's associated with the object, and I can see that there's little keyframes down here at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom of the timeline, excuse me, that indicate, all these different change in parameters, position, scale, rotation, whatever it is. And I could go in and I could select these and delete these. If I need to, I can just go in and right click on them and hit delete, and you can see that those keyframes start to go away. So I do have some control over this of getting rid of keyframes, but in the event that I want to get rid of an entire animation, there's a couple of different ways to do it, but at this point, the easiest thing to do is just select the object, delete it, get rid of it, and recreate it. The animations that we're going to be doing are just really simple camera animations. And so imagine, if you will, that this cube is the camera, and the camera is pointing down the Z axis. Well, maybe I want to do a fly through of my city, or a fly down the street. Maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of start up here in this position, kind of up in the sky, and I'll go to the rotation and I'll point that down so my camera's looking down the street, down at my buildings, at my street. I'm going to back up my playhead to the beginning of time, or maybe I want this animation to start a little bit later in time, so I want to pause, and maybe I want the animation to start at frame 15. I'll place the playhead at frame 15 and record that keyframe. I'll then advance the playhead later in time. I'll go to move, and I'll just kind of move this. Maybe I'll rotate it to kind of straighten it back out a little bit. I'll go back to move, and I'll send that camera down the street, and I'll just record that keyframe. So now what we have is we have the camera that slowly kind of pitches as it changes and flies down the street. And of course, if we want to really control that animation path, we can do that by just really refining the camera. I'll just move it down right at about frame 30. I'll hit the record button to update that keyframe. I'll also grab the rotate tool, rotating the wrong direction, and just try to get that to pitch upwards a little bit and update that keyframe. And so now when I play this, I'm really kind of swooping down in and flattening out that view. Now, obviously this is just a cube and not a camera, but a camera is just an object, and I'll show you some other ways that we can really quickly and easily, in fact, in some ways, much more easily than even animating this object, ways that we can animate the camera. So experiment with simple animations in a different project, and then we'll apply what we know about animation back into our city project, and we'll talk about strategies to render that. So we'll do that in the next presentation.